Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and review for our Unit 1 interim on evolution. Here are some of the vocabulary words that you need to make sure you are familiar with, understand them when you see them in text, and can use them yourself. Those vocabulary words are adaptation, natural selection, morphology, refute, accept, common ancestor. Take a minute and read the vocabulary terms along with their definitions. Make sure that you're able to use those in a sentence. Some other vocabulary terms that we're going to see on our interim that we need to make sure we're familiar with going in are extinction, mutation, variation, alleles, gene, and selective pressure. Again, take a minute to read the vocabulary word, its definition, and make sure that you could use it in a sentence. More vocabulary terms. These terms, again, are terms you're going to see on Interim 1, so please make sure you're familiar with them. Advantageous, biodiversity, habitat fragmentation, speciation, evolution. Let's go into some specific practice to prepare us for Interim 1. On this slide, we're given an example of the rock pocket mice. Now, this is something we did earlier in the unit, so this is mostly review for us. There are 4 parts to identifying if natural selection has occurred or to be able to describe a natural selection process. So here we have our rock pocket mice. Our rock pocket mice are mice that used to exist on a tan environment. A lava flow occurred at some point during time, and the rock pocket mice that went up to the lava flow, if they were tan, were eaten pretty quickly, whereas something happened and some of the mouse became black. Over time, the percentage of mice increased. So let's look at the story of the rock pocket mice in terms of natural selection. What variations existed with the rock pocket mice? There were tan rock pocket mice, and there are black rock pocket mice. What changed in the environment? What changed in the environment, there was a lava flow that changed some of the rock from tan to black, meaning that the predators were more easily able to see the tan rock pocket mice. Number 3, what trait was favorable after the change? Well, after the dark lava flow, the dark colored trait, which was a mutation, became the favorable trait as it was able to blend in with the dark rock. Number 4, how did the population of the lava change? The population changed, whereas 100% of the mice were originally tan. Over time, as the tan mice were eaten and the black mice were able to hide, they reproduced, passing on their dark colored gene. So over time, the percentage of dark mice increased and the percentage of tan mice decreased. So we can look at numbers and data to tell a story of how populations change over time. So here we can predict the percentages. After 20 generations, the percentage went from 95 to 85 to 75. What would we predict after 60 generations and then after 80 generations? So as the tan percentages we can see are decreasing, what would be happening with the black percentages? Your job is to fill in the rest of the chart. What was happening to cause the change in percentages? And then, what do you predict will happen in 140 generations? What would the percentages be at that point? And why do you think so? Continuing on the rock pocket mice, what would have happened to the mice with the dark colored mutation if there had not been a lava flow and the land had remained tan in color? Well, if there was no lava flow, then that mutation for dark color would have made those mice stick out on the tan rocks, and the birds would have come along and eaten them. So that mutation was not an advantage. What does that tell us about mutations? That mutations are not always an advantage, nor are they always a disadvantage. Mutations are just changes. If the mutation allows an organism to better survive, then it will become the more common trait. If the mutation does not allow for better survival, then that mutation will die out. If it's a mutation that doesn't have any selective pressure on it and nothing is influencing it, it's just going to become another mutation and another variation within the species. Another example that we've talked about this unit are the peppered moths. The peppered moths, very similar to the rock pocket story. So we remember the peppered moth story of the Industrial Revolution in England in the 1800s. Let's go through the 4 steps. Number 1, what are the variations? The variations are the colors of moths. There were light-colored moths and dark-colored moths. Number 2, what changed in the ecosystem? What was the selective pressure? The trees, because of the Industrial Revolution and the burning of coal, the trees became covered with soot and dirt and turned black. That made the trees darker in color, and it made it so birds were more easily able to see the white moths now compared to the black moths before. Number 3, what was the favorable trait? The favorable trait now for the peppered moths after the trees change color is the dark colored moths. Those are the favorable trait. And so what happened in time with the population, what happened over time is that where it was mostly white moths that were able to hide on the white trees, now the opposite was true. The white moths stood out, they were being eaten by the birds, and the black moth population was able to increase. The graph on the left shows the change of the proportions of each moth of the population over time. So what would the graph look like if there were no visual predators eating the moth? Well, again, there has to be something there creating selective pressure. So if there's no visual predators eating the moths, if there's nothing that is selecting one version over the other, then the graph would be flat. There would be no moths. There would be no change in the moth populations because there's nothing that's choosing one color over the other in their environment. Now, moving on to the Galapagos finches, which were studied in the 1800s by Charles Darwin. So let's talk about Darwin's finches. Why do we talk about finches? Because Darwin's finches are a really good example of what we learned about with the juncos if the junco population is doing what it's doing for the next couple hundred years. So we've looked at this graph several times. This is a phylogenetic tree where Darwin initially looked at morphological or the physical traits of the birds to determine who was related to who. Now, scientists from the 1950s on, since the discovery of DNA and the technological advancements in looking at genes, were able to determine genetically which ones are related. So now we call it a phylogenetic tree. You're going to notice that there's a video linked on the slide. You're going to watch that slide. You're going to watch that little short segment of text, and it's going to give us some information. How do scientists know that the finches all have a common ancestor? Now that you've watched it, what's your answer? We know that scientists know they have a common ancestor because they've been able to look at the genes of them. And they've been able to trace back the mutations and see that genetically they're all related to one species that came from the mainland. So what makes a species a species? In order for a group of organisms to be considered a species, they have to be a group that only breeds within themselves and produces fertile offspring. What that means is for something to be a species, the males and females of that species have to be able to breed and reproduce, and their offspring have to also be able to breed and reproduce. So when we talk about, for example, the different varieties of juncos around North America, they're all considered one species, even though they look very, very different. The reason being that in areas where their habitats overlap, they breed with each other and they can produce offspring. And then those offspring can breed and produce more offspring. Well, what would be an example of this not being true? We know that horses and donkeys, for example, are definitely a different species. Can we breed horses and donkeys together? Yep. And we get a mule. Well, mules are a hybrid animal. A mule is sterile. We can't take a mule and breed it with another animal and produce offspring. The reason is their genetics are too different that the offspring is not fertile and not able to reproduce. In general, how does one species become two or more? That process of natural selection. As the process of natural selection happens over and over many generations, Eventually, there's a mutation that then separates the populations, and the populations no longer interbreed. An example of Darwin's finches was that as the beak sizes changed, as the beaks got larger in some of the birds, as they were eating larger foods, their song changed, the way they sounded changed. And so the males with the larger beaks, as they would sing, the females with the smaller beaks would not respond any longer to that song. So even though they could genetically breed, morphologically, they had gotten to the point where they were different and they no longer bred with one another. So what happens when those populations interact? So in the example of Darwin's finches, they've separated into different species. When they interact, they are not interbreeding. So while genetically the finches can breed, what keeps them from breeding together? Two main things. Number one, their breeding behaviors. In the case of birds, it's often bird song. The other factors that can influence is distance. They live on different islands from each other, and so they don't interact with each other. Living hundreds of miles apart, they're not going to breed with each other, and so they're going to be considered a distinct species because they're not around each other. A third potential factor is time of breeding. As we learned with our juncos, the UCSD juncos breed in February, whereas the Mount Laguna birds breed in May. So even if they're the same environment, because they breed at different months, they're not going to be breeding with each other. So let's look at some morphological traits. This finch has a shorter, wider beak for eating seeds that have fallen from plants. Which of the finches is it most likely related to and why? So if we look at this finch, we're going to see that this finch is probably most likely related to, this is a medium ground finch. If we look at the image on the left, well, looking at morphological traits, I think that this bird is probably most related to the large ground finch. Notice that its beak is of a similar shape and size. So what about our juncos? How do we apply all of these skills to the junco population? So what are the variations in the juncos? Well, the variation were the habitats. We had the University of California, San Diego population, right? And we have the Mount Laguna area. What are the variations within the birds? We had birds that had bolder behavior, right? So birds that were bolder and less scared of humans when exposed to humans, and birds that were much shyer. What changed in the environment? What changed in the environment is humans built a city in what used to be a desert area. By adding vegetation and water and sources of food, the habitat was changed. When humans built that city, we move into 3, which trait was favorable? The birds that were bolder and less scared of humans were able to access the food and the water and the resources, even with humans around, because humans didn't bother them. And so they were able to access and use those resources to establish a population. So how did the population on the campus change over time? The bolder birds that decided to stay, because of the influence of the city lights, they breed earlier, they breed more often because they have higher testosterone levels, they sing earlier in the morning, and they also have shorter wings and shorter tails, just like fighter jets, to be able to navigate and move around the tight spaces and to get away from the predators that are present on the campus. Whereas the Mount Laguna birds maintain longer wings, longer tails for being able to maintain those long migration routes. So, looking at the article on the slide, are the different types of juncos considered different species? As of this time, genetically, they are not considered different species. They're considered subspecies. The reason being that in areas where the birds interact with each other, where their territories overlap, scientists have often found hybridization, where the birds with the different variations, interbreed with each other and produce offspring that can reproduce as well. Let's talk about habitat fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation is when we take an environment and we split it into different areas. This is another way that we can force natural selection and evolution to happen. Fragmentation can happen either by human activities or by natural activities. Take a minute to answer the questions on the slide. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Besides building roads, which would be a main example of fragmentation, what are some other causes? Some human causes are things like urbanization, the development of cities, could be the building of dams where once there was a narrow river, there is now a large lake separating habitats. You can have human-caused fires, right, coming through and separating the forest to create different environments or land for their cattle. You can have large fences and walls built. Some natural causes would be flooding, tornadoes, forest fires, and drought could cause habitat fragmentation as well. Think about back to those Galapagos finches. How could habitat fragmentation be connected to what happened to the finches? Well, their common ancestor came to the island, and as the finches bred and reproduced and flew from island to island, their populations became isolated. Habitat fragmentation is basically creating islands of habitat where the animals can't move from one habitat to the other, one island of space within the land. So they're kind of like land islands. So how could fragmented habitats be reconnected to allow species to move between them? Well, I like to think of my grandfather who liked to go down to Florida every winter. He liked to spend his time on Key West. Key West is a small island on the south of Florida. There's many, many people that live on those islands. So how do humans get from island to island? Of course, they can go by boat, right? And so that would work for animals that swim, but humans don't swim. And if we're not taking boats, we want to drive our car. Well, we're going to build a bridge. So one way to reconnect species or areas of land would be to create some kind of bridge to allow organisms to move between them. Think about, for example, if I want to go to Canada. How do I get to Canada from Detroit? I've got a couple options. I can go over the Ambassador Bridge. I could take a boat, but I'm probably going to get stopped by the Coast Guard. Or I can take the tunnel. So there's a couple ways. Going over the barrier or under the barrier are two ways that humans can design and engineer solutions to allow organisms to move from one fragmented habitat to another. What about here in Michigan? Are there any other examples in our real world? Well, here's a really cool story. I've showed you pictures early in the semester. I love to go to Kensington Metro Park, and I recommend you do the same. But if you go to Kensington Metro Park, you can hand feed the birds. The question is, are the birds' behaviors genetic or learned? What I want you to think about is think about these studies that we read about where they determined if it was learned or genetic with the juncos, their bolder behavior. How could we set up a similar study for the birds at Kensington? Hint, you need to go back and review the parts of how a common garden study is carried out. That concludes the ending of our review. Make sure you review your lessons, your vocabulary, and your content, and good luck on your interim.